Michael Palmer, why don't we, if you're ready, we'll get started in just a minute. Are you ready?
Yeah, I am ready. So I need to share my screen. I'm ready to go.
Well, first of all, my name is Michael Hallberg. I'm a past president and I'm chairman of the Adult Education Committee. We are just absolutely delighted that you found time for us down here at the oldest Jewish congregation in Alabama. We're so thrilled to have you with us. I want to just very briefly read the short bio that I have to make sure everybody knows who you are.
Okay, thanks.
Michael Palmer is a photographer whose work has explored the architectural legacy and relevance of the German Jewish exodus from Germany in the 20s and 30s. His first book documents previously ignored aspects of the 1930s buildings in Tel Aviv's historic White City district, a center for German and other Central refugees in the 1930s. Michael Palmer's most recent work focuses on the buildings of the noted German Jewish architect Erich Mendelsohn, including Mendelsohn's breakthrough Einstein Tower near Berlin, synagogues in St. Louis, Cleveland, St. Paul, and Grand Rapids, as well as his buildings in Israel. Michael began his photography career in 2015 with the Tel Aviv White City Project. Previously, he had a career in the pharmaceutical industry, research and development. Again, Michael, on behalf of all of us here, we're delighted to have you with us, and we appreciate your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I am very happy to be here speaking to you all this evening, and thanks for coming. So what I'm going to do now is I'll share my screen, and once that's accomplished, we can get going. So I got into Erich Mendelsohn and his synagogues in America really totally by accident. I was in Tel Aviv and I was interested in, as Michael mentioned, the White City buildings. Took a tour and I met a guy called Michael Gross, who runs the Bauhaus Center in Tel Aviv. And he was looking for a photographer to work with him on a book about Tel Aviv, and I did that. That was about a year-long project. When that project was done, I was looking for another project. I liked doing it a lot, and I wanted something along the same lines to do. Michael mentioned the architect Erich Mendelsohn. So Mendelsohn was born in 1887. He died in 1953. So he's really strictly a first half of the 20th century architect. He's, as Michael mentioned in the introduction, he's a German Jew. He was born in East Prussia. He had a career in Berlin, and we'll have a bit more to say about that very soon. What's interesting and what I found fascinating about Erich Mendelsohn was the fact that the major events of his life really mirrored the major events in Jewish history during the first half of the 20th century. And that meant that a story about Mendelsohn and photographs about Mendelsohn would also have relevance to the Jewish experience from 1900 till around 1955 or so. And that made him particularly interesting to me. And also the fact that he had built and has buildings standing in Germany. He has significant buildings in Israel and also these significant buildings in the US. So for all those reasons, I wanted to do Erich Mendelsohn. So I started out and I went to this building. This is the Park Synagogue in Cleveland, that amazing dome. And I walked inside, and the very first thing I realized as soon as I walked in was that this building alone, with that magnificent dome, could be a book in itself. And the more I spoke to the people at Park Synagogue, the more real and the more pressing really the need for that kind of book was. So I started there. I wanted to fill out the experience and maybe do more about Erich Mendelsohn's other synagogues in the US. He has the other three we're going to be talking about. So that sort of was the genesis of this project. I started in the Park Synagogue, started taking photographs there because it was such an amazing structure. And I found that the other three were maybe not on the same level as Park Synagogue, but certainly amazing structures on their own. So what I want to talk about this evening has four main units, you could say. First, a bit about Mendelssohn's dwelling and wandering. As I mentioned, he was born in Germany. He spent significant time there, significant time in the UK and in British Mandate Palestine and the US. And so he did really have a wandering phase in his life, really for most of his life. I talked just for a minute or two about Erich Mendelsohn's circle. Those are the people that he knew in Berlin, because knowing a little bit about the circle he traveled in gives us a lot more information about Mendelssohn as a human being. And then something about his wandering again. And then finally, half of the presentation will be about his work in America in the four synagogues. So if we look at the picture on the upper right-hand side, there's Eric Mendelsohn with a wheelbarrow. And next to him is his wife, Louise Mendelsohn, and she also has a wheelbarrow. And what's going on here is this is the first day of the building of Mendelssohn's villa in Berlin. So when this picture was taken, actually around 1929, Mendelssohn's office in Berlin was the largest architectural office in Europe. He had some 40 people working for him. So, excuse me. So through the decade of the 20s, through the Weimar era in Germany, he was increasingly prosperous until towards the end of that decade, he was really very successful and was able to build a villa, a really magnificent villa that we'll see more of this evening in Berlin. 1933 was the year it all ended for him. So Hitler came to power in January 1933. Only a few weeks later, the Nazis passed a law in Germany that expelled Jews from the German professional societies. So Mendelssohn was a member of the Prussian Architecture Society. And sure enough, come May or so, he received a letter from the president of the Prussian Architectural Society informing him that because of the edicts of the Nazis, he was going to be expelled from that organization. It wasn't just humiliating, but it also meant that he couldn't work as an architect anymore. Because in order to work as an architect in Germany, you had to be a member of one of these societies. Once he was expelled, his authority to sign off on blueprints and plans ceased. So he could work perhaps as a draftsman or work in another office. That wasn't for him. So in 1933, he left. He moved to England and he stayed there for some 7 or 8 years. During the time he was in England, he also started traveling to Jerusalem. So around 1935, he opened up an office in Jerusalem too. So for a number of years during the 1930s, he had an active office in England and he had an active office in Jerusalem. Among the projects that he built in Jerusalem were the Rambam Hospital in Haifa and Hadassah Hospital in Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. So if you've been to Israel, you may have heard of those two institutions. They're both very well known. His hospitals in those two cities are still there. His buildings are still there and they're still being used as hospitals. They're still really central parts of the hospital campuses for those two institutions. In 1941, with the war in Europe and the war in the Mediterranean heating up, Mendelssohn wasn't able to get commissions in Palestine. He couldn't get commissions, he couldn't get building supplies. Concrete and steel were being requisitioned by the Brits for the war effort. There was no private construction going on. He decided to leave. He needed to work as an architect. So in 1941, and through a very roundabout route, avoiding active conflict in Europe and North Africa and the Mediterranean, he went from Palestine to Basra in Iraq, to Karachi in British India, to Bombay in British India, to Cape Town in South Africa, from Cape Town to Trinidad, Port of Spain, Trinidad, and from there he went finally to New York, and he got to New York about May 1941. He lived on the East Coast in the Hudson Valley for 5 or 6 years during the war. He wasn't a US citizen, and he wasn't allowed to practice architecture because he wasn't a US citizen. So he managed to support himself during those war years, teaching architecture and giving lectures. In 1945, he moved to San Francisco, and he was able to get an architectural license, and his active years in the US began then from 1945 to the year he died in 1953. So this is Eric Mendelsohn when he was about 7 years old. He's on the left, the boy on the left. He's the second from the left. And he was born in a town in East Prussia called Allenstein. And this is a picture that was taken there. So his family lived there for a while. I don't really know. I think certainly generations perhaps. His father was a haberdasher. His mother was a milliner, I believe. And as you can see, the family was fairly prosperous and well-to-do. So they're certainly well dressed. They're well taken care of. They look healthy. And as a matter of fact, his father was well, even though he was a Jew, and Jews were persecuted or suffered from anti-Semitism in Germany in the late 19th century. His father was respected in Allenstein and actually was elected to certain honorary positions in that town. So they were doing pretty well. This is Eric when he was about 21 years old. He liked landscape painting and oil painting. He had a real artistic bent, not a surprise since he was an architect. So this is about the time when he began going to architecture school. So to go to technical college, he moved from Allenstein to Munich, and he did most of his formal education in Munich. This is Louisa Maas, who later became Louisa Mendelsohn. This picture was taken when she was about 16 years old. And as you can see, she was a cellist. She loved the cello. She had had ambitions of becoming a professional cellist, but that didn't work out when she got married. That wasn't something she could do as a married woman. As a matter of fact, she got married shortly after this photo was taken, or around the time the photograph was taken, when she was just a teenager. Unlike Eric's family, which was sort of maybe lower middle class, merchant kind of, or trades people kind of background, her father and her family were much more well-to-do, and actually they were quite wealthy. So her family traded in fabric, silk and other kinds of fabrics, and they lived in Mainz, and they had a very nice life there. They as a matter of fact, in her household, they spoke English instead of German. That was part of the sophistication of the sophisticated lifestyle that her father and her parents wanted their daughters and their family to live in. So when she got to England a few years later, the language wasn't really so much of a problem for her. So this is the happy couple. This is 1916 when they got married. So obviously during the First World War. Eric was in the German army during the First World War. He served initially on the Eastern Front facing the Russian army. When the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia, they reached an agreement with the Germans, and the war on the Eastern Front stopped, and Eric was transferred to the Western Front. And he was there as well during the war. In 1918, he was decommissioned from the army and he moved to Berlin to begin his practice. So this is the picture that we saw a minute ago. This is 1929. This is at the height of his fame in Europe and Germany, and the height of his fortune as well. So that's Eric Mendelsohn on the right with a wheelbarrow. That's his wife, Louisa, in the middle, and their daughter, Esther, is on the left. So again, I think looking at the way they're dressed, you certainly get the sense that they're leading a very charmed life in Berlin. So this is Esther and her dad, Eric Mendelsohn, on the back patio of their house, their villa, horsing around a little bit. This is about 1930. This is around the same time. This is Eric Mendelsohn on his patio in his garden, and you can see how well the house is sited. There's a lovely lake in the background behind him. And this photograph was taken by the well-known celebrity photographer, Lotta Jacobi, who was very active in Berlin. So like Mendelsohn, she was a Jew. And it turns out that many of the people that Mendelsohn associated with, many of the people that worked for him and many of his clients while he was in Berlin were Jews. So just a word about his circle. So that woman on the right with a cigarette in the camera is Lotta Jacobi, whose photograph we just had a look at. At the top is Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of Israel. Now, Weizmann didn't live in Berlin. He was actually British. But once Mendelsohn got to Palestine, Weizmann sought him out to build his villa there. So Mendelsohn and Weizmann were associated and worked together. On the left-hand side is Martin Buber. Now, I don't know if Mendelsohn actually was an acquaintance of Buber, but he was well versed and studied Martin Buber's philosophy, and Mendelssohn and his wife Louisa often discussed Buber and his philosophy in letters and probably in conversation as well. So Buber was an important personality for him. And at the bottom, you probably recognize Albert Einstein. And the reason I picked a photograph of Einstein with a violin is because he was a frequent visitor to Mendelssohn's villa with his violin. So a minute ago, we saw a picture of Louisa Mendelssohn with her cello. So it wasn't unusual for Einstein to come to the front door of the villa with his violin in his case and to come inside and take the violin out and play with Louisa. She would be on the cello, he'd be on the violin, and maybe they'd have other players along as well. So this is the world that Erich Mendelsohn lived in, a very sophisticated world. He was a member of the Jewish intelligentsia in Berlin, and he thrived there. Now I want to take a second and look at Erich Mendelsohn's villa a little bit more. So in 1932, he published a book about this house that he had built because he was very proud of it and he wanted to show it to other people. And what's really instructive about the title of the book, it says Neues Haus, Neue Welt. So we expect an architect's book about his house to be called New House because the house is a structure, it's a place where somebody lives. That's what you expect an architect to do, to make a design that's habitable, or even more than that, that's comfortable. What's really interesting about the title Mendelssohn shows is that he also called it the New World, Neue Welt. So certainly he's building a house to live in, but also he's building a house that exists in a new world. And he was always talking about his idea of a new world. And that was the new world of modernism. He was an advocate for it. He saw it as a philosophy that he wanted to spread. It was in his work. And the reason I'm going to dwell on this for a minute is because it came up again when he was working with his clients in the United States, and it caused trouble for him. So he didn't want to just build a lovely synagogue. He wanted to build a synagogue that epitomized the new world that Erich Mendelsohn understood was happening. And when he took that to building committees, it usually worked out to cost a lot more than just the new house would cost or the new synagogue would cost. So he was constantly in conflict about his budgets and his buildings and what he wanted to do because he was such a rigid adherent to this idea that a building has to not just be a structure, but also a representation of a new world that he was creating for mankind. So this is Erich Mendelsohn's new world in his house in Berlin. So it was typical of Mendelssohn that he would design exteriors as well as interiors. So this is like a living room in the house. So he designed everything in the picture except for that work of art on the wall. So the textiles Mendelssohn designed, he designed the chairs, the table, the rug, he picked the color. And what I've done is I've pulled out a segment from the caption that he wrote, and I've highlighted a piece. And what I highlighted says he wanted to construct a room that was in harmony. He wanted all the pieces to be in harmony, and that was his idea of the new world. It wasn't just comfort, but it was harmonization. And exactly this phrase of harmonization is something that he put in front of his clients in America and told them that they had to come along on the trip he was taking in his life. So this is the front of the Mendelssohn Villa in Berlin. You can see it's gated. Of course, it was a very exclusive kind of place. And this is a view of it from the side. It's slightly elevated, and you can see that it, of course, has a modern look. He has a lot of patios. He's a really lovely site, lots of trees and lawns. He has a very rectilinear building with white walls and a band of windows that we can see there, and a flat roof. It's sort of typical, perhaps Weimar modernist kind of building. Not really much of a surprise, but that in Berlin at that point in time, that was the new world. And in fact, when the Nazis came to power, that was one of the things that they decided they didn't want in Germany anymore. This idea of flat roofed white square buildings, and that was part of the reason people had trouble with their careers under the Nazi rule. So one thing that I want to talk about with this building, though, before we go on, is the fact that it's still there. This is what the building looked like in 2016. So I took this photo. It's essentially the same structure. It's still occupied by one family. It's not Mendelsohn's family. It's had a varied history over the 85 or 90 years of its existence. But what's been constant is the fact that the building has worked for almost a century. It's been a house, a family has lived there, and it's functioned for them, and it functions today. Between 1930 and 2016 or today, there was a lot of history in Berlin. As we all know, a lot of buildings were destroyed. Many things didn't survive, but this building did. It survived. People kept it. They restored it, and they loved it. And that's very typical of Eric Mendelsohn's buildings. They lasted and they worked. So he could do the new house part very well. He also did the new world part very well because this building still looks modern, even though it's almost 100 years old. And that's so typical of Eric Mendelsohn's work. So the city of Berlin put up a plaque or a sign acknowledging that this was the place where Mendelssohn lived for a number of years. So his wandering. So as I said, he left Germany in 1933, only a few months after the Nazis came to power, because he wasn't able to work independently. He went to England and he formed a partnership with Serge Chermayeff, and this is one of their most notable buildings. It's called the Delaware Pavilion, and it's on the English seaside. What you notice here is that it's a little bit different than his house. It has that big curved structure in the front, and that's typical Eric Mendelsohn. We're going to see it on many of his buildings. He really loved curved surfaces, and he thought they gave his buildings a lightness and a lyricism that more typical Bauhaus or Weimar buildings did not have. So we'll see that over and over again in his buildings. Again, also there's a lot of glass here, and that's also very typical of Mendelssohn. The other typical thing is that this building is still in use. So it's a beach pavilion. It was built as a beach pavilion around 1936. It was renovated by the city of Bexhill in 1996, and today it's still being used as a beach pavilion. So that's some 80 years later. The building still exists, it still functions, it's still alive and doing what Eric Mendelsohn meant for it to do, and it still looks good. This is the Chaim Weizmann House. This building was built in 1936, although this is a picture that I took there about 2016. So one thing to notice clearly is, again, that curved surface in the middle. So typical of Eric Mendelsohn. The other thing to notice here perhaps is that it's utterly symmetric. So the right side and the left side are precisely mirror images of each other. And this idea of symmetry, again, is a Mendelssohn concept. It was obviously used before, but it was something that he adhered to, even though in the typical Weimar or Bauhaus architecture, the idea of symmetry was abhorred. You couldn't make a building with symmetry. You could use repetition, but symmetry was out. Mendelssohn, as always, was his own man, and he did it the way he wanted to, and he made it work. And this is an example of that. So again, this is an 80-year-old building that looks pretty good, and it's still functioning. It's a museum today, not a house, though. So Mendelssohn's America phase. I think what I like to do here before we go much further is I'd like to stop and see if anybody has a question or a comment on what we've talked about so far.
Mr. Palmer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Gil Layden. I wanted to ask you, I know, of course, that Mr. Mendelsohn, it established a reputation for building synagogues in the U.S. Did he have a similar type of reputation for doing so in Europe and elsewhere?
Yeah, interesting question. He built his very first building in Germany when he was still a student in Munich was a religious community building in a cemetery in his hometown of Allenstein, East Prussia. And that building, again, is still there. It didn't do so well in the war, but it was restored by the community. It's now in Poland, not in Germany anymore, but the Polish town that succeeded the German town renovated it, restored the structure, and made it into a tourist site. So he built that. He didn't build a synagogue per se in Germany. He didn't build a synagogue per se in Israel either. In Israel, he built hospitals and various kinds of community structures. He built the Weitzman House. So his history as a synagogue builder is really strictly a history in the U.S. That's where he started doing that, although it's something he had dabbled in a sense in Germany, in Allenstein, and also in his wife's hometown of Mainz, where he built a similar structure. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay, so I'll go on then, and we'll take comments or questions again at the end. So this is an inventory for Eric Mendelsohn's exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So you can see the date here says November 1941 to January 1942. That's when the exhibition was held. The reason I'm showing this is because it demonstrates that Eric Mendelsohn hit the ground running when he came to the US. So he got to the US in May. Only some 6 months later, he already had an exhibition going at MoMA. That's a testimony to the reputation he had here in America that preceded him. So when he got here, he was already well known. He could get an audience at the MoMA, and he could get gallery space there to show his works. And what he showed mainly were models and sketches and photographs of the buildings he had constructed in Germany and in British Mandate Palestine. And that's what's on this list. It starts with his very first building, his first significant building. That's the Einstein Tower in Potsdam, Germany. And at the bottom of this is page 1 of the list, is the Anglo-Palestine Bank in Jerusalem. And both those buildings are still there. The Einstein Tower was built as an observatory 100 years ago. It's still an observatory. So Potsdam University is using it today as an observatory with the telescope in it. And it's amazing. It's still functioning and functions quite well after 100 years. Very rare for a scientific structure. Anglo-Palestine Bank also, it's still there. It's next to the main post office on Jaffa Road in Jerusalem. It's still there. It's still functioning. It's not a bank anymore. When I was there a few years ago, it was an unemployment office, but everything that was in the bank was there. The teller counters were there. The waiting room was there. The artwork was still there. It was an amazing sight to see. This building had lived and functioned essentially unchanged for some 80 years. Now, Mendelsohn and synagogues. So the MoMA exhibition was 1941 to 1942. And as I mentioned, Mendelsohn earned his living during the war years as a lecturer and an educator, not as an architect. When the war was over and people learned about the Holocaust and events in Mandate Palestine were heating up towards the establishment of the State of Israel, there was talk in America about how was the American Jewish community going to react to these events. The Holocaust, the war, the establishment of the State of Israel was going to be a new time for American Jews. And Rachel Vishnitzer Bernstein, in this article in the Journal of Commentary, said it was going to be a new time for American Jews. So like Eric Mendelsohn, she came from Berlin to America in the 1930s. She was an art historian, and she had, I guess, an expertise in architecture, and she became a spokesperson for ideas about how synagogues should look in the post-war period. And she wrote this article to explain what her ideas were. And as you can see, she says, creating a style expressive of America. She's talking about an American kind of architecture. And what she says is that the world is different. It's really different for Jews and for American Jews. And that it's time perhaps for the American Jewish community to express their identity a little bit more strongly than they had in the past. So, as she points out, historically, Jewish communities wanted to blend in. They didn't want to stress differences with a larger community or look conspicuous. They didn't really want to stand out. They didn't want to be seen. But she is saying that now with the new post-war world, it's time to move away from that. It's time to express ourselves as Jews, to be conscious of who we are, and and be proud of that identity. So she said that conspicuous Jewish community buildings proclaimed this new freedom and equality of the Jew at home in America. Those were her words. That's what she was talking about. And she mentioned 4 architects in the article, and she explicitly mentioned Eric Mendelsohn as one of the architects that she thought could take the ideas that she had written about and make them reality. And Mendelsohn was absolutely enthusiastic about that. And a few months later, he wrote an article, or a small article, a response really, that was also published in Commentary, and he embraced Rachel Wissner's ideas. So why did he embrace it? Embrace them because he really thought this idea of speaking loudly about who we are was what made perfect sense. It fit in with his notion, excuse me, that he didn't just build synagogues, he built a new world. That's what he was all about. So this is a building that he built in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's Mount Zion Temple. And I think we can all agree that this is really a conspicuous building. It stands out. It's even flamboyant. It also is proud of the Jewish identity of the community that built it. You can see Mendelsohn put a large, very large menorah on the front of the main structure in the synagogue. So as you walk along the street that's here, you're going to see it immediately. You're going to know it's the Jewish community structure, and that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to proclaim what it is, exactly what Rachel Wissner was talking about in her article. And if you look at this synagogue from the street view, this is a view from the boulevard that this building is situated on. Again, you can see that it is, if anything, not inconspicuous. It's a very conspicuous structure, and it proclaims exactly what it is in a very loud, flamboyant way. And as a matter of fact, when I was there in St. Paul and I spoke to the people in the congregation, they told me that, yeah, that was exactly what the people who built this some 70 years ago had in mind. And they cited it in this particular neighborhood for a very good reason. So you can't see it in this photo, but behind me when I took the picture was a row of really mansions. There's no other way to describe them. And the mansions, as the people in the synagogue described it to me, told me, were built and owned by the men who had made fortunes in lumber and mining in Minnesota. And this particular part of St. Paul was their neighborhood where they lived. And the Jewish community picked that neighborhood explicitly to make this statement that here we are, and we're as good as you, and we're staying here. Exactly what Rachel Wissner was talking about, and Mendelsohn was probably delighted to help them make that kind of a statement. So this is B'nai Emunah Synagogue in St. Louis. This was actually the first synagogue that Eric Mendelsohn built in the United States. So you can see it has a much more of a European flavor than Mount Zion Temple does in St. Paul. It was built a few years earlier. But again, it's certainly a conspicuous building and flamboyant in its own way. You're not going to walk by and not look at it and want to know what it is, and you're going to know what it is right away because it has a big Jewish star on the side of the building, right by that big parabolic roof that you see on the right-hand side. And when you walk around to the side of the building, you see a classroom wing. This is classrooms for children in the school that was associated with the congregation. So we can see, as we saw in Mendelssohn's, some of his other buildings, he loved glass and used glass a lot. He also thought that education was vital to having a synagogue and a Jewish community center. So each of his 4 synagogues has a classroom wing. Each of his 4 synagogues has a sanctuary, and they all have a social hall as well. One thing that I find fascinating about this is the use of glass, not just that he used glass, but about what glass means, and especially what glass meant when this was built in the mid to late 1940s. So glass is a very strange kind of material if you think about it. It's strange because on the one hand, it's very weak. If I have a hammer, I just go pop and I break it. It's not like a brick wall. It's fragile and weak. On the other hand, it's very strong because just like brick or some other kind of material, it separates inside from the outside. But that separation only works when everybody agrees, those on the outside and those on the inside, that this glass wall is going to stand. So what we saw in Germany in 1938, only 8 years before this was built, was Kristallnacht. And the very point of that Nazi pogrom against Jews was to break the glass, to make the statement that this was strong, but now it's a weak barrier and we're going to break it. And that's our statement about your status in Germany. So the people who built this certainly were aware of that. And they built this certainly to make a statement that they felt confident. Erich Mendelsohn was a German Jew. He left Germany. He knew what he was doing. So the fact that they used glass on their classroom with their children there means that they felt that the civil agreement between everybody in their community was solid and wasn't going to be broken the way it was in Germany. And for the past 75 years, it's been that way. So again, it's certainly a structural statement. It's a statement about architectural style, but it's also a statement about the position of Jews in American society in 1946 until today. This is the Park Synagogue in Cleveland. And when this dome was built, it was the fourth largest dome in the world. And certainly it's flamboyant, I think, even today, so many years later. You can see underneath the dome, he put in a glass wall once more. So this is a building that's going to be noticed. We're looking at it here from the rear entrance, which is the main entrance. It was built as the rear entrance. Today it's the main entrance. So it's not quite the street view, but it's sort of the entranceway view to what this building looks like. Not hidden at all. And this is the front door. And one interesting thing to note about the front door is that you see there's like two anchors on the right and left of the door. And those actually are the Hebrew letter Shin. So in Cleveland and in this synagogue building, Mendelsohn seemed to be obsessed with Shin. And he used it as a motif, a design motif on either side of the door. He wove it in to many different details of this building throughout the synagogue. So whenever you're walking around that synagogue, you might stumble on something and say, wow, that looks like a Shin. And it is, because they're everywhere. I don't really know why he was so obsessed with it, but it's unmistakable that he was using the Shin and wanted to use it over and over again in that building, and also to a lesser extent in his other three synagogues. This is Temple Emmanuel in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So this was actually the last building that Erich Mendelsohn built in the United States. The last major building he built in his life. It was finished after he had died. It's somewhat less overtly Erich Mendelsohn. He still has this idea of lyricism, but expressed not so much in curves here, but as in the roof line, where he's got the roof kind of flaring up, kind of like the wings of a bird. And again, he has a lot of glass there. And this is the street view of the same building. So we can see again how it's sited in a very sort of bucolic location with lots of trees and grass. Very, very visible, not blended in any sense, but totally conspicuous and identifiable for what it is. And that was the conscious decision by Erich Mendelsohn in that community to do that, to make that kind of statement. So just sort of to underline the idea that these Jewish communities knew what they were doing. They wanted to have a bigger profile, a more self-confident stance in their hometowns after the Holocaust and after World War II and with the establishment of the State of Israel. So this is an article that was published in the Grand Rapids Press in 1915. They've saved it in their synagogue archives for 70 years. I was there a couple of years ago and they showed it to me and I photographed it. So what's in the picture is a photo of a model of Mendelsohn's building, not an actual photo of the building. But what the article talks about is the fact that the Jewish community is making a new synagogue. They've brought in this very well-known architect to design the synagogue, and there are a few quotes from Mendelsohn. So the idea, again, that the Jews in Grand Rapids wanted everybody in the city to know what they were doing and that they were there. And this is the building committee in Grand Rapids. So Eric Mendelsohn is the guy with the bow tie in the center. And on the left with the glasses is Michael Gallus, who was Mendelssohn's assistant in San Francisco. And looking closely at this, it looks to me like they haven't started to eat yet. So I imagine it's pretty calm and relaxed, but probably once Mendelsohn talked about what he wanted to do and how much it was going to cost, the ties got loosened and maybe the silverware and the stuff on the table got moved around a bit. At any rate, at the beginning was all very, very well set and well laid out, and looks cordial. Now, the reason I'm talking about his relations with the buildings committees is because the synagogues actually had records about the discussions, and I could see reading letters and talking to people that these kinds of very hard discussions often happened. As a matter of fact, in Minnesota, at one point, they stopped paying him. They were so unhappy with the cost overruns and his level of communication. So that's the exteriors of the buildings. And as we've mentioned, Mendelsohn was concerned with everything about his building. So if he wants to make a building in harmony with this modernism, this new way of thinking, he's got to worry about the outside, how it looks outside, where it's located. He's got to worry about the Torah ark, the eternal light, the menorah. In the Park Synagogue, he worried about the doorknobs and the doorstops. He designed all of those things down to the least detail. He designed textiles, he designed the Torah breastplates, the whole bit. And what's most remarkable is that for some 70 years, the congregation there has maintained all of that and kept it up. And when it needed to be fixed or restored, they fixed or restored it. So Rachel Vistenser had things to say as well about interiors of synagogues. And what she said was that we have to respect tradition, but we don't have to mimic tradition. So we can interpret symbols. We can interpret a menorah, for example. We don't have to copy the way the menorah was in the old synagogue or in a synagogue 100 years ago. We can take the idea of the menorah, modernize it, and put it in these new buildings. And that was exactly what Eric Mendelsohn wanted to do. But it wasn't always appreciated. So this is a letter from Rabbi Gunther Plaut, or a letter to Rabbi Gunther Plaut from Eric Mendelsohn. And this was about the St. Paul Synagogue. So Gunther Plaut was a very, very well-known rabbi in the Reform movement, and he wrote a commentary that's used to this day in various synagogues, especially Reform communities. So what I've highlighted in red is this phrase, sentimental remembrance. Because apparently reading this, the congregation had said they wanted to move some of the items, maybe the menorah, from the old synagogue to the new synagogue. And maybe they had called it sentimental remembrance, or Rabbi Plato called it that. And Mendelsohn is taking that term and turning it around to a derogatory term. And what he's saying, was I've highlighted in green, is this phrase of a new world in harmony. So when we talked about his house in the book he wrote, Neues Haus, Neue Welt, he had exactly the same phrase there 20 years earlier, a new world in harmony. So that was something that was integral to his makeup and his being, the idea of a new world where everything was in harmony. And remember, this is 1950. He didn't give up on his ideas, even though he maybe had lots of reason to be discouraged. He wasn't. It was something that was totally part of his makeup, and he stuck to his guns, even when it put him into conflict with the congregation. And that's part of the reason he only built 4 synagogues. So this is an example of a menorah. You can see it's not your traditional menorah. You can recognize it as a menorah. It has 7 branches, like the menorah in the sanctuary in Jerusalem. It has sort of the candle flame idea at the base of each of these candlesticks. They kind of look like candles, but they're not like any menorah before or after, probably. So this is um, the idea of the menorah inspired by the menorah, but not bound to anything that had been done before. And this is what Mendelsohn did for a menorah in the small chapel in Cleveland. So in Cleveland, there's a large sanctuary. Underneath that, under the dome, there's a small chapel, and this is the small chapel. You can see this is quite a different representation of a menorah than the one we just saw from St. Louis. He's gone to something a little more traditional. It's more recognizable as a menorah, and it's totally different from the one we just saw. In St. Paul, this is a third way of doing it. So this is different from the previous two. It's more modern, more abstract than what we saw in Cleveland, more like what we saw in St. Paul, in St. Louis, but it's absolutely unique to itself. You can see how he's used the arms of the menorah to work with um, the vertical lines on the wall. So this structure in St. Paul is very vertical, unlike say the dome at the Park Synagogue in Cleveland. When I look at this, it kind of reminds me of a crankshaft. And I don't know if that's what Eric Mendelsohn was thinking. It could be, because this idea of machinery was very, very much integral to his idea of modernism. And this is the menorah that he had at Temple Emmanuel in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So it's kind of like what he did in Cleveland, but not exactly. The candlesticks there were round. These are square in cross section. And the design itself is actually quite different, a bit more abstract. So these are the four menorahs that he built. They're all still in use, and they're all different. None of them are like a traditional menorah, but they're all inspired by that idea. Now the Torah Ark. This is St. Louis, the first one that Eric Mendelsohn built, and it has sort of a retro look. I guess in 1950 or 1946, maybe it looked modern. This maybe is a bit more dated than some of his other things, but if you look at it close up, it still is a very interesting design. So this is a close-up look of the close-up view of the St. Louis Torah Ark, and he has these sort of wavy lines that reminds me of water when I see it. And they say that Torah is like water, and it could very well be that that was what Eric Mendelsohn was thinking. He wanted to emphasize this idea of Torah and water flows downhill, and it satisfies the thirsty, and so maybe that's what he's reminding us of with these wavy lines. In Cleveland, it's wooden doors, and you can see, as I mentioned, he has this obsession with the letter shin. So he's put 10 shins up on the Torah Ark door, and that's very unusual. Typically, what you'd see there would be the Aleph Bet down to Zion for the 10 Commandments. Hebrew letters, each letter signifying one of the 10 Commandments. He's used the shin 10 times to do the same thing. Now, it might be he was thinking of one of the names of God Shaddai, which is the name on the mezuzah, written on the outside of the mezuzah. As far as I know, and as far as I could find, he never really expressed why he used the shin, but clearly it was an idea that possessed him, at least here in Cleveland. And these are the Torah breastplates that they told me in Cleveland he had designed. This is St. Paul, Minnesota. Here he's using metal. You can see he's taken the shin idea and repeated it in that motif on the front like a grill, but he's made it a bit more abstract than he had done in other places. And his final building in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So the door in the center there at the bottom of the picture says Shema Yisrael. Actually, Shema Yisrael. So that's the text that he used. So it's a different idea than he had used in the other three synagogues. And he repeated the shin. You can see sort of above that, you see a large shin with kind of a shadow behind it. And that was Mendelsohn's design along with those leaves. The mural design itself was not Eric Mendelsohn. He died before he had a chance to specify a design or to work with the artist. He had picked the artist. Her name was Lucienne Bloch, but he was gone when she started to work, and she went on her own to do the design for this mural. And finally, the Ner Tamid, the Eternal Light. So this is Cleveland again. This is under the Great Dome, and it's several feet across, and that sort of cone shape at the bottom, it makes me think of a rocket ship engine. Perhaps that was in Mendelsohn's mind, I don't know. That's a very modernist kind of thing, and it may be that was something he was thinking of when he designed this. In the same building, in the small synagogue, he designed what they call the sunflower chandelier to be the Ner Tamid. So it's a totally different design than what he put into the large sanctuary under the dome. It's round. It has the notion of a Ner Tamid, of a light, but it's really very sculptural, unlike perhaps some of the other things he had done, and unlike more traditional eternal lights. Again, this is unique and different from everything else he had done. This is in St. Paul, Minnesota. So he's gone back to the Shin motif here. Here it looks to me like a wagon wheel, actually, when I look at it. And since Minnesota has something of the pioneer legacy and the pioneer spirit, it might be that he was thinking of that when he designed this and installed this in St. Paul, Minnesota. So again, it's absolutely unique. And again, it's survived for some 70 years. So finally, closing up, this is a letter that Eric Mendelsohn's widow, Louisa Mendelsohn, wrote to Temple Emmanuel in Grand Rapids. So he had died in 1953 in the middle of building Temple Emmanuel. And they sent Louisa a condolence note. And a few months later, she answered them with this. And what I wanted to point out, especially in the second paragraph, she wrote, "I know that with Eric's buildings, a great and noble bird, his spirit will dwell with all of you." So if you remember, that was the building with sort of the flaring out roof, and it looked a bit like a bird. So apparently this idea of that building being modeled on a bird was something that Eric and Louisa had talked about and discussed. So he saw this building as a metaphor for something bigger, as he always did. And she mentioned it here in this letter. So this is his life, the chronology. Is that so? As we said, he was born in Ellenstein, Germany, which is now in Poland. That was 1887. He practiced architecture in Germany for some 20 years, 20 odd years, 21 years, in Berlin. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power and he was expelled from the Architectures Society, he left Germany. He moved to the UK. He practiced architecture in the UK. Around 1935, he opened an office in Jerusalem. So he was somehow commuting back and forth between England and Jerusalem for perhaps 3 or 4 years. And then he moved full time to Jerusalem until 1941. In 1941, with the impossibility of doing any construction because of the war in Palestine, he moved to the US and sort of lay low teaching in the US until 1946. And the period we're talking about this evening is that period from 1946 to 1953, when he built these 4 synagogues in the United States. And he died in 1953 in San Francisco. So this is the book, and it's available on Amazon if you're interested. So if you go to Amazon in the search window, put in Eric Mendelsohn and my name, Michael Craig Palmer, it'll take you to the book and you'll be able to get a copy. So what I'd like to do now is open it up to questions again. And if you've got a question or a comment, I'd be very happy to do my best to answer it.
Mr. Palmer, Jill, and again, I hope I'm, forgive me for, I hope I'm not hogging anything, but with this at the height of the synagogue building in America, I was just curious in whether there were other competitors who were of the same rank as Mr. Mendelsohn?
Yeah, I think this was sort of the beginning of a real increase in synagogue construction. So as far as competitors go, yeah, he had competitors. I think the major competitor was a man named Percival Goodman, and Mendelssohn mentions even in his letters to his wife how he was hoping that Percival Goodman wouldn't submit a design for a competition he wanted to be in. So they did face off. Percival Goodman was native-born American, perhaps a little easier to get along with than Eric Mendelsohn was, and I think they often went head to head. And I don't know for sure what the scorecard was. Mendelsohn got these 4. He lost others. Probably he lost some to Percival Goodman. Now Mendelsohn died in 1953, and Percival Goodman was designing synagogues through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think he may even have designed some after that. So I think he designed something in the 80s, like 83 synagogues. So yeah, there were certainly a lot of synagogues built in that post-war period. And Mendelsohn had just a tiny percentage as far as numbers go. As far as influence, I think he grasped what Rachel Wissenser was talking about as well as anybody else, maybe better. And in his embrace of those ideas, he was influential, even though he only built 4. So Percival Goodman, I think, that would be probably a major competitor to him.
Are there any other questions? If not, Mr. Palmer, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It was quite interesting. I was thinking as I was listening to you that your book or a couple copies of your book would really look good in our library and would allow those of us on the call to have a look through. You said it's available on Amazon?
That's right. So you'd have to put in Eric Mendelsohn and Michael Craig Palmer, and then you go right to it.
Well, good. I'm gonna make sure that happens. We'll
Okay.
get a few, and we thank you for your time. Unless
Thank you.
anybody else has a question, we'll sign off.
Thanks very much for your attention. I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to you tonight.